Hello and welcome to the first webinar of Kohera, Why Upgrade to SQL Server 2014. Today I'm going to discuss with you some new functionalities of SQL Server 2014 and what kind of benefits that you can have for your company. Alright, before we get started, a little bit more about me. My name is Pieter van Hove and I'm a SQL Server MVP and database consultant working for Kohera, of course. Performance tuning, SQL audits, migrations and training are part of my job. After this session there will be a possibility for questions and answering. You can also follow me on Twitter, just look for Pieter_van Hove, and if you would like you can also tweet with the hashtag webinarkohera. I also have a blog where I just share my SQL Server experience. A bit more about Kohera. We were funded in 2007 and we're part of the Kronos Group, one of the biggest consultant companies here in Belgium. We have more than 100 customers in all different kind of sectors, like the government, for example, or the health sector. We also are a Microsoft Gold partner, and we are currently having more than 27 certified database consultants in database administration, Microsoft Business Intelligence, and we currently also started working on the big data part of SQL Server. Alright, enough about me and Kohera. Let's have a look at the agenda. Today we will cover the following 3 points. First of all, I'm going to share my thoughts on why it's so difficult for me to convince you to upgrade to the new version of SQL Server. Secondly, we will see what the benefits are for your business by upgrading to this new version. And finally, I'm going to tell you in short which new features are available in SQL Server 2014. SQL Server 2014 has been released 1st of April of this year. This is really not a joke. And in my job, I get in touch with lots of different customers, and I also have to install lots of SQL servers, new ones. Now, during the last few months, it was a coincidence and I had to install many SQL Server instances. So I tried to convince my customers to install the brand new version, SQL Server 2014. But unfortunately, they all told me that they didn't want to install it, but they wanted to upgrade or install SQL Server 2012 instead. I wondered what motivated my customers to install an older version instead of the brand new one. Why is it so hard to convince people to start using SQL Server 2014? Well, after questioning my customers, I figured out the following 5 reasons. First reason that I hear is I don't trust it. This is probably the most common argument of my customer. They don't trust the new version because it just has been released and will probably have a lot of bugs. Most of my clients, they tell me, no, let's wait till Service Pack 1 has been released, then we'll actually know that it will be stable. Now, most of my clients are telling me that there are just too many risks to install an RTM version of SQL Server. And what will happen if something will fail? I will not be prepared for it. Well, certainly Microsoft doesn't release a version of SQL Server that is not stable or not fully tested. Okay, it's true in the beginning of a new release that more bugs are found, but I wouldn't state that a new release is unstable. Microsoft is still releasing service packs and cumulative updates for other versions of SQL Server. But that doesn't mean that this software is unstable. No, definitely not, because you probably are currently using that version right now. Bug fixes are always part of software, despite of if it's an old or a new version. I've noticed that many clients don't even know that there is a new version of SQL Server that has been released. They just install the older version. Or they have heard about the new release, but they're not aware about all these new cool features that are available. And that is where Kohera comes in. We make people aware of all these new functionalities with SQL events, with webinars like this, for example, with workshops and blogs. Another reason that I hear a lot is that the vendor of the software package is telling to the client, we don't support SQL Server 2014 yet. So what you can do eventually, you could install that new version, but then you will probably lose all support on your software. So what I usually try to do in that case is I try the upgrade advisor to see if there are some exotic configuration in the database. And mostly it isn't. And I just send that report to the vendor, and that can help them by supporting the SQL Server 2014 version much faster. Upgrading to a new version of SQL Server is a project that requires some investments. Not only the license cost, but also you have to buy new hardware, recode your application, test your application again. So many customers today are complaining that the Enterprise edition of SQL Server has become really expensive. But what I've mostly noticed is that when you check the database or when you check the business of the customer, that they actually don't need that Enterprise version, that a standard edition would be enough. However, if you do need the Enterprise edition, it might be worth starting a consolidation project instead of an upgrade project to save your license costs. The last argument is mostly no time, too much work. I hear that a lot. Upgrade? No, sorry, we don't have time for that. Or why should we upgrade? The database is just running fine and we have other priorities. Everything new is a little bit scary. Of course, I understand that. It takes some time and effort, it costs money, and people will have to get used to it. Sometimes sticking with the old seems like a better option, but in the long term, that will actually end up by being more expensive and time consuming. Alright, let's have a look what the benefits are for your business when you will start using SQL Server 2014. SQL Server 2014 makes it easier and more cost-effective to build high-performance, mission-critical applications, enterprise-ready big data assets and BI solutions that can help employees make better decisions faster. These solutions have the flexibility of being deployed on-premises, in the cloud, or in a hybrid environment, and can be managed through a common and familiar toolset. SQL Server accelerates reliable mission-critical applications with a new technology which is called in-memory OLTP engine, which can speed up your transactional performance by 30 times. For data warehousing, a new updatable ColumnStore index can query 100 times faster than legacy solutions. SQL Server 2014 was designed to work in a hybrid environment that spans on-premises and the cloud and has new tools that makes it even easier to build backup and disaster recovery solutions with Windows Azure. Get to insights faster with a complete BI platform that speeds up how you access, analyze, clean and shape both internal and external data. With SQL Server 2014 and Power BI for Office 365, it's easy to connect every user in your organization to the right data they need to make the better decisions faster. In this today's webinar, I'm going more into detail on the mission-critical performance and the platform for hybrid cloud. The BI part will be taken off topic and will be discussed in a second webinar of Kohera. Let's go a little bit more into detail on mission-critical performance. With groundbreaking in-memory technology built-in, SQL Server provides mission-critical performance for the most demanding database applications. Actually, you don't need to rewrite the entire app, no. You just have to change your database a little bit so that you can use the in-memory technology. And even this new functionality will or can fit in your existing hardware. So you don't need to buy any new hardware if you want to use this new functionality. So it will be a big cost saver for your company. The high availability of SQL Server will give you the nines that you need. Microsoft added extra replicas. You can offload your reads and backups to a readable secondary, and with synchronous replication, you will certainly have zero transaction data loss. SQL Server 2014 also supports Windows Server Core, which means that you will have to patch less on that server. Less patching means also less downtime. Well, about security there is nothing much to say, except that SQL Server has constantly been ranked the most secure with the least amount of vulnerabilities 5 years in a row. Now let's talk a little bit more about the platform for hybrid clouds. Your business requires a flexible IT infrastructure that can scale on demand. With a private cloud in your data center, you can be more agile and manage resources more effectively. When you extend your data center to the public cloud, you're working in a hybrid cloud model. A hybrid cloud gives you the best of both worlds, so you can take advantage of external resources when it makes sense for your business. The Microsoft Hybrid Cloud combines Microsoft Azure, Windows Server, and Microsoft System Center, giving you a nice overall platform. Alright, let's talk a little bit more about licensing for SQL Server 2014. Well, actually, there is nothing different about the versions of SQL Server 2014 compared to SQL Server 2012. We still have the Enterprise Edition, which is used for mission-critical applications and large-scale data warehousing. This version, of course, includes all the product features. The Business Intelligence Edition is for premium corporate and self-service BI, and this version includes all premium BI features and the standard DBA features. And last, we have Standard Edition for basic database, reporting, and analytics. There are two main licensing models that apply to SQL Server. You still have the Server plus Call, which actually provides a license for every user or every connection to the SQL Server. Secondly, you have the per core licensing, which is used when you're unable to count the user devices. To license a physical server, customers must license all the cores in the server. A minimum of 4 core licenses is required for each physical processor on the server. If you're using SQL Server in a virtual environment, you can also have two options. First of all, you can license an individual virtual machine. To license a VM with core licenses, purchase a license for each virtual core allocated to the VM, here also with a minimum of 4 core licenses per VM. Next to license an individual virtual machine, you can also license the complete host. Customers can deploy an unlimited number of VMs on the server and utilize the full capacity of the licensed hardware. By fully licensing the server with Enterprise Edition core licenses and SA coverage based on the total number of physical cores on the server. A little bit more about licensing for high availability. Beginning with SQL Server 2014, each active server licensed with SA coverage allows the installation of a single passive server used for failover support. The passive secondary server used for failover support doesn't need to be separately licensed for SQL Server as long as it is truly passive. This means if it's serving data such as reports for clients running active SQL Server workloads or performing any work such as an additional backup from the secondary server, then it must be licensed for SQL Server. That brings us to the last topic of today, choosing between SQL Server 2012 and SQL Server 2014. There is a variety of benefits to skipping 2012 and going right to SQL Server 2014. Not all of the new features may be applicable to you today, but you should also consider that taking advantage of them later will be easier if you're already on that version. Well, let me give you a quick overview of all these new functionalities in SQL Server 2014. In-memory OLTP, or also called the Hackathon project, is a new database engine component fully integrated in SQL Server. It's optimized for OLTP workloads to achieve significant improvements in performance and reduction in processing time. Tables can be declared as memory optimized to enable in-memory OLTP capabilities. The most important difference between memory-optimized tables and disk-based tables is that pages do not need to be read into cache from disk when the memory-optimized tables are accessed. All the data is stored in memory all the time. A set of checkpoint files are used only for recovery purposes. The engine is designed for high concurrency and blocking is minimal. In some scenarios, the improvements in performance and throughput can approach 40 times faster. For memory-optimized tables, there are no locks required, and thus no waiting because of blocking. But that doesn't mean that there is no possibility of waiting when using memory-optimized tables. There are other wait types, such as waiting for a lock write to complete at the end of a transaction. And the best execution performance is obtained when using natively compiled stored procedures with memory-optimized tables. Delayed durability means your transaction can continue without waiting till it's written to disk. It assumes that the lock will be written. This is a good way to compensate for a reliable but slow disk subsystem at the risk of data loss. Delayed durability enables write transactions to continue running as if the log has been flushed to disk, but in reality, the writes to disk have been grouped and deferred to be handled in the background. The transaction is optimistic, so it assumes that the log flush will happen. In other words, if your transaction log is not currently a bottleneck, don't turn this feature on, because you will need to be tolerant for data loss. If your server crashes, for example, you will lose the transactions that have not been written to disk. In the AlwaysOn availability groups area, SQL Server 2014 now supports 8 secondary replicas instead of 4, which is great for scaling out the read-only portions of your workload. There have also been enhancements to reliability. In SQL Server 2012, if the primary or quorum become unavailable, so do the read-only replicas. In SQL Server 2014, this situation does not cause the secondary to be unavailable. There are also new ways to use Azure to support your on-premise environment, like hosting an entire replica in a Windows Azure VM. These features can help avoid the prohibitive costs associated with the second data center, especially if it's only being used for these specific features. In SQL Server 2012, ColumnStore indexes were introduced as a great benefit to certain data warehouse workloads. But they had several limitations which made them practically only in very limited scenarios. They were non-clustered, supported a limited number of data types, and most importantly, they were read-only after creation. In SQL Server 2014, this feature set has been expanded to support now clustered column store indexes. Many of the data type limitations have been removed, and the index is now writable. They've also introduced a new archival compression algorithm with a much greater compression rate. So, with the newer version, you will have a much better opportunity to use this feature to your advantage. Let's talk a little bit more about the higher max memory limits. Standard and BI editions now support 128 GB of memory. SQL Server 2008 R2 and 2012 only supported 64 GB. Enterprise Edition now supports up to 640 cores and 4 TB of RAM. This limit is of course lower in a virtual machine, but due to the operating system and Hyper-V limitations, not to SQL Server itself. The same limits on CPU, memory and data file size still exist for SQL Server Express Edition. Buffer pool extension is a way to use fast SSD drives to substitute for memory. This is great for cases where your database size exceeds the amount of RAM, especially if the server does not support adding more RAM. Even though RAM is cheap, it's not always possible to just add more memory into the server. This technology stores only clean pages on the SSD drive, allowing for faster access through the buffer pool to data that would otherwise have been pushed back through standard I/O access methods, which would be much slower even in the case where the data and the log files are also on SSD. Since only clean pages are stored, this does not impact durability whatsoever. New resource governor settings allow you to throttle I/O at the instance level, controlling the number of I/O operations sent to the disk subsystem. At the resource pool level, you can use minimum or maximum IOPS per volume to set the minimum number of IOPS to reserve and the maximum number to allow per resource pool. In both cases, this is measured in the number of operations, regardless of size. Okay, let's have a look at the cloud solutions that can be provided by SQL Server 2014. One of the most fundamental administrator tasks is backing up and restoring databases. With SQL Server and Windows Azure, you can safely back up your databases into the cloud. The key benefits of using the backup and restore capabilities of SQL Server with Windows Azure Storage as a backup destination includes the following. First of all, limitless low-cost storage. Can you imagine how much it costs to buy hardware to take locally backups? And if you compare that to the low-cost storage of Windows Azure, it's pretty cheap. The storage in Azure is also highly available, which means that it is geo-redundancy. Also off-site storage that can support disaster recovery and compliance requirements. And it's also a simplified remote backup and restore process. So you don't have to worry about looking for the correct tape to perform a restore. No, your backup files are actually just there in the cloud. Instead of taking a backup to local disk or to tape, you will now have to take a backup to a URL, which will put your backup file into Windows Azure Storage. I always hear the remark of my customers telling me that you never know who can actually access the data that is in the cloud. That's true, but SQL Server provides now backup encryption, which enables you to encrypt the data while creating a backup for your storage destinations. That can be on-premises, but can also be, of course, in Windows Azure Storage. Next to that, Microsoft also introduced a new functionality called the SQL Server Managed Backup. This will automatically take backups of your database depending on the workload. You don't need to configure any backup jobs anymore. No, SQL Server will do this for you. And last but not least, Microsoft wants to have a consistent backup solution. So it created a SQL Server Backup to Windows Azure tool. What's in a name? And it enables you to take backups of databases that are stored in older versions of SQL Server, starting from SQL Server 2005 onwards. Having a stable disaster recovery solution for your databases is essential for your business's success. Most customers need to configure a disaster recovery site and purchase additional hardware for database replicas, which of course costs a lot of money. Now with SQL Server and Windows Azure, you can maintain one or more replicas for your databases in the cloud. Now what kind of advantages do you have by configuring that? Well, first of all, you will have a low-cost disaster recovery solution because actually you don't need to buy the hardware, you just need to buy the VM. Secondly, you have transparent application failover. So when your primary site goes down, it will fail over to the DR site without even your application knowing it. And last but not least, you can also use this available replica for offloading your read workloads and backups. There are several tools on the internet and techniques available to move existing on-premises databases to SQL Server in Windows Azure virtual machines. But now, starting with SQL Server 2014, a new wizard, Deploy a SQL Server database to a Windows Azure VM, is available for you to deploy the database to another SQL Server instance running in the cloud. Alright, that brings us to the end of this webinar for today. Let's have a wrap up. I've started this webinar with addressing the wrong perception of my clients on upgrading to SQL Server 2014. And I hope that with this webinar, this has changed a little bit. Secondly, we have seen what benefits your business could have by upgrading to SQL Server 2014. And finally, I have shown you in short which new features that were available in SQL Server 2014. Well, thank you for listening to our first Kohera webinar. Here on this slide you can find all our contact details. just have a look at our websites, and you can also follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. If you should have questions, there is now a question and answer possibility, so just let me know.